my timer on because I'm worried about being too long. I am speaking as a layperson. I'm not speaking as a member of Root and Branch or Spirit Unbounded, but thank you for that lovely introduction. It was very kind of you. I'm also on holiday, so without a printer, so I'm kind of reading from another screen here, so I will try and do my best. I'm going to try and explain why I personally think the synodal process has been, for many, a cynical exercise in the manipulation of the laity. I'm hoping there are some people here who will put me right but this is how I'm feeling at the moment. I also think that it was wrongly conceived, and I'll explain why, that it has merely revealed a clear division between those who will and those who will not adopt co-responsibility with the laity, and why I'm fearful for the future with no new structures to move things on in proper consultation of the laity ahead of the synod in 2024. It seems that the whole of next year could pass without any obligation to consult the laity at all. Going to my experience of the synodal process as a parishioner, it was obvious in England and Wales from the moment the card from Bishop Bernard Longley dropped into my pew that for me, it was going to be another corporate exercise in consultation. Now, I've worked in BBC and ITV, and what they do is they tell you what you can and can't discuss, and they suggest that it will all feed into something they've already got plans for in the future. And it always ends up the same. Nothing the workforce says really goes anywhere unless it already agrees with what the management has already decided. And then the management can say that they are doing what the workforce has voted for. So everyone's happy, except for the workforce. In my very enlightened parish in Oxford, full of academics and medics, my experience was terribly poor. I was shocked. It was because it was handled by a lay volunteer who censored shamelessly, for whatever reason. I know it was much better in Ireland, but I also know that a lot of reform-minded Americans feel as similarly let down as I do. So for me, this huge discrepancy of experience, you cannot say that this was an organized synodal structure, more a ramshackle collection of accidents. Now, one of my colleagues at Root and Branch, Maggie Conway, did a content analysis. You can still see it on Root and Branch's website. And it shows that much of what was said at the diocesan level in England and Wales was then ignored by the bishops at the national level. Had they already made up their minds? I don't know. But did something similar happen at Frascati? We know that the people who got together at Frascati didn't have time to read things like Weingard's Constitution. They were never showed it. How about that survey of 17,000 committed women from Catholic Women Speak? I don't think that got through either. There wasn't time to read that sort of thing. I heard that they only read what the bishops had submitted. So let's talk about the bishops. It was an assembly of bishops. I mean, that's what they've called it. They've said it was the 16th Assembly of Bishops. I mean, I thought it wasn't going to be that. Anyway, the text looks like, for me, an awkward stitch together of two unreconcilable points of view, with no agreed way out of this impasse. For me, the absence of concrete proposals and the reliance on hopes and wishes is proof that the synod was poorly conceived. And that's because there was no authority for the synod to mandate any changes. Now, maybe that was deliberate. Perhaps it was only ever meant to be an attempt to alter language, and it has done that. And we all know that moving language on is important. But why didn't they tell us this in the first place? Would we have spent quite so much time sending them our proposals and surveys if we'd known from the very start that Pope Francis really wanted to know how we felt, but that no actions could be taken as a result because there was no mandate for change? Would we have responded the same way? Surely we want deeds, not words. And so briefly to the report itself, it's not so much a synthesis as the minutes of an unresolved quarrel. One voice, one wonderful voice, is filled with hope, with renewal, and the fresh air of a spirit unbounded, and the other exhales the icy damnation of an episcopacy that lacks the faith to let go of its privileges. By the end, we understand that this isn't the first document of a new synodal age, which is what we were all hoping. It's the verdict of yet another episcopal conference that lacked the discernment to halt the church's long decline, which we are all aware of. So the first voice rejoices in the equality of all the baptized and their co-responsibility in the governance of the church, even in matters of doctrine. These amazing bishops point with excitement to the emerging lay church of small communities. It is, they say, a charismatic sign, but the counter voice has no time for this model, doesn't want a new model. It concedes we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, but it adds damningly that each of us is called to differentiated co-responsibility. And then there follows the chilling observation that, this is the quote from the synthesis, pastoral practice at the parish, diocesan, and recently even universal levels increasingly entrusts lay people with tasks and ministries within the church itself. So for all their talk of synodality, these bishops don't actually consider the laity to be within the church itself. Instead, the laity will have to be, as they put it, quotes, inserted into the missionary dynamism of the synodal church. Now, from where I am, a synodal process in which the bishops retain the power of decision is not a synodal process. To claim that a process of listening to the laity, which many of us say didn't happen, validates the bishop's conservative conclusions seems to me cynical. There is a central paradox. To create a synodal church, you need the bishops to give it their blessing. Well, we've all heard the cliche, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, but it's appropriate. Timothy Radcliffe, a wonderful man, in his carefully prepared meditations in the days preceding the synod, tried to convince those members of the synod who turned up to listen to him, and they didn't all, that they need not be afraid of sharing power with the laity. There's nothing to fear, he said. Well, we'd met him a few days before he set off for Rome, and we'd shared with him the basic ethos behind Spirit Unbounded. We found we were on the same page. But his words, anyone's words, Pope Francis's words, Pope Francis told the bishops, you've been inflicting scorn, mistreatment, and marginalization on the laity. It doesn't matter how many words can never be enough to persuade those whose entire lives are built on clericalism to give it up, which is why I say the synod was poorly conceived. It never had the power to do anything. Pope Francis will have to create a synodal organization in order to set up a synodal organization. Well, the bishops did take one clear decision at this assembly, which I missed until my husband pointed it out. They didn't have the courage to tell us it was a decision. Look at paragraph 11D. They're talking about vocations, and they call it vocations to the priesthood. They call it a young man's vocation. A young man's vocation. In other words, they've already decided not to ordain women. They don't tell us, they don't have the courage to say so, because they know that millions of faithful laity, in other words, the consensus fidelium, has plainly called for the ordination of women. The bishops have no intention of seeing that happen. So for all its honeyed words, we see that the decisions of the synthesis are all conservative, the decisions, and the proposals are all, without exception, for kicking issues into the theological long grass. And we need to face up to what has happened. So to conclude, can anyone really tell me that as a result of the 2 years of synodal listening and discernment, the church is more safe, more just, and more inclusive? From where I see it, unless the Pope himself takes up your case, and I know he has done with individual victims of clerical abuse, with individual priests who've come out as gay and whose careers were threatened, unless the Pope does it, you don't have a chance. No stories have ever come out, however, of the Pope taking up a woman's mission to be ordained. That would be wonderful. So surely this is madness to rely on one person, however enlightened, to help us all, to help 1.3 billion people with their challenges of living the Christian life. No matter how benign or forward-thinking, the Pope is a monarch, and you can't have a synodal monarchy. It makes no sense. I'll end there.
You could hear the applause, Penelope.
Oh, I couldn't.
Spontaneously from around the globe. Thank you for that honest, hard-hitting presentation within the time, which was wonderful, but also so thought-provoking. So I can only imagine what's going to happen with the question and answer session. So we look forward to that. And for the moment, then, we leave Penelope's excellent presentation and we turn to Father Diarmuid O'Murchu, who is a missionary of the Sacred Heart, priest, and he's a prolific writer, a social psychologist, and he combines the wonderful thing that comes through in Diarmuid's writing and in his many workshops. He has the ability to combine theory and practice, and in a hands-on way, which enriches his writing and also becomes very challenging because he says it as it is. So Diarmuid, we look forward to your critique. I happened to bump into Diarmuid in Dublin City this afternoon, and he said, there have been many fine words. I think Penelope said honeyed text. I'd like to critique the outcome of the synodal process. So Diarmuid, we hand over to you and look forward to your input. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise, and thanks, Colm, for inviting me. Good evening, everybody. So in the limited time I have, I'm going to go straight into some of my thoughts and observations. Firstly, I'll endorse the general ethos that we're reading in the tablets and other journals coming out of the synodal experience. An awful lot of comments on the round table as a new metaphor and a whole new way of doing synods. Now, of course, the metaphor and the reality of the round table has been in our world at a whole range of different situations for the past 50, 60 years. So one feels a bit sorry that it took the church so long to catch up with the power of this model. Secondly, very strong emphasis on listening. But again, following particularly on Penelope's words, listening needs to lead to some kind of an outcome of being more proactive. And I'm not sure or convinced that that's going to happen. I very much like the title that was given to the feedback: communion, participation, and mission. These indeed are three very central theological concepts of our faith as a Christian people. I don't think we have done justice to them in any way. We haven't really opened up their deeper meaning in this particular synodal experience. There are two sections that I very much warm to in the document, but again, they need a great deal of elaboration and particularly theological reflection. So section 5 talks about the church out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. Penelope very rightly drew our attention to the fact that the Catholic faith community today is that of 1.3 billion people. Now, a lot of Catholics, I don't think, are aware of that. Not a lot of Christians generally. In 1960, 2/3 of the population of the Catholic world lived in the white Western realm. Today, 80% lives in the South, and only 20% now in the white Western world. So that statement, out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, needs to be re-examined in the light of who we are as a Christian faith community. We are predominantly a church of the South. We are predominantly a church that's poor and struggling. And the whole configuration of our church has changed dramatically. And personally, I believe that is the work of the Spirit primarily, and therefore requires a great deal of discernment on its meaning. Because we all know that the Church of the South is excessively clerical and imperialistic still. That I would suggest is the remnants of colonialism. And so how to do justice to that section of the document is a major piece of work that really is not even named in the synodal process. Section 4 talked about the Church of the Poor. Absolutely right. But then it should have talked a lot about justice, or what today we call eco-justice. And those concepts, again, are scarcely mentioned in the outcome of the synod. Now, section 8 at the end of the document, the church is mission. Absolutely right. Again, as a theological naming. But once again, the theological foundations are very poor and very shaky. The main theological deficiency that I see in the document and in the outcome from the synod is that there's a total lack of dealing with the primacy of the new reign of God. The phrase kingdom of God is mentioned a few times and seems to denote what life will be like in the life hereafter. But that's not the primary meaning of the gospel notion of the new reign of God. And so that as a theological foundation, if that could be honored and if that could be established more clearly, then I think we might have a lot of the different outcomes that Penelope is desiring and many more people along with her. Then there are a few major issues that need to be looked at afresh. Again, Penelope has very rightly highlighted. So the word synod, or the concept of synodality, arising out of Vatican II, as I understand it, was primarily meant to be a forum of consultation between the Pope and the bishops. That is actually written into the opening paragraph of the statement that came out of this synod. So Penelope is right. It's another gathering of bishops. And the primacy seems to be all around bishops. So we need clarification, or at least I need clarification. What is new in this supposedly new forum around synodality? Because at the heart of it, it is still the primacy of the clericalized power. That's a major issue that needs serious redress. The whole attitude of listening, which I've already commented on, again, our church and our wider Christian world, our wider spiritual world, has seen that as a primary dimension of discernment, going back for at least the past 50 years. So again, my fear and concern here is that the listening kind of put an emphasis on we all being very nice to one another. Being nice to one another in that kind of way is not a gospel value. It's not the prophetic stance. It doesn't enable or empower us to start challenging the serious issues that need to be looked at. There are two, for my mind, there are two major issues missing totally in this synodal process. And it will be critically important from my point of view that they be addressed at the next session. Now, I don't think they'll be addressed, but at the very least, I would hope they might be named. And so that's why I'm going to name them tonight. We are living in a church where there's a serious, irreversible decline of clericalism. Priesthood, as we know it, is going to die out completely in Europe in the next 10 or 20 years. And in the next 20 to 30 years, it's going to enter into rapid decline throughout the entire Catholic world. That needs to be faced if we're to be honest with ourselves and honest with our God. Secondly, a corollary then to that is the whole notion of sacramental experience, or the experience of doing sacraments. Sacraments belong primarily to the people. They do not belong primarily to priests. Sacraments are the Christian articulation of the human capacity for ritual making, a capacity with which we're all endowed, going back into ancient times across thousands of years. That's what sacraments are meant to represent. The fact that sacraments have become wrapped up with clericalism and with priesthood is a gross deviation in terms of the deep theological meaning of sacramentality. Again, my hope is that that might be named, because we're not going to address it in any kind of a serious way, spiritually or theologically, until it is first named. And then my final comment, a desire insofar as a process will begin to happen. And will it begin to happen? Timothy Ratcliffe talked about the next year being a time of germination. My great concern and fear is that it might be a time of stagnation. One thing I'd like to see happening is that insofar as meetings will begin to take place and conversations might be revived, whether by the instigation of Pope Francis or whoever, that the clergy and the bishops keep out of it completely. I'm not trying to create a new exclusion here. In fact, I'm inviting bishops and clergy to stay out of the meetings completely. And in that way, giving a very clear message to the people of God. The church of the future is going to be in your hands. Come on, get on with it. Also, I see in that gesture a hugely important, we in the North, with all our serious issues and concerns around decline and so forth, perhaps this is one powerful prophetic gesture that we can make on our own behalf, acknowledging in honesty before God and among ourselves the reality at which we're at in the serious decline, and also a powerful prophetic gesture for the Church of the South, which is still heavily influenced by clericalism. That we in the North, taking this prophetic stance of inviting and allowing our clergy to stay out, that we are saying the future for all of us, North and South, is in the hands of the people of God. That is one of my hopes and dreams for the next year. Whether it will happen, time alone will tell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. As always, challenging, direct, took us right back to the gospel, the true message that's being lost there, the prophetic, the kingdom of God, rooted in justice and courage, looking forward. So again, it's going to be very interesting when we get to the question and answer time. So thank you for your provoking, challenging talk, as always. And now to Julieann Moran. Julieann is the, just need to look at my notes, the General Secretary for the Synodal Pathway of the Catholic Church in Ireland. She courageously has represented us at every level and done so with such authenticity and honesty. And there's one just small vignette that I think demonstrated to the bishops that she was equal to them, and in fact, possibly was able to take a stand and name the elephant in the room when she was in Prague for the European continental phase of the synodal process. And referring back to exactly what has already been said by Penelope and Diarmuid, the inclusiveness, but the obvious sign was when they went into the gathering in the meeting room, the table, the top table, was 6 men, not a woman in sight. Yet this was billed as inclusive, gathering together, men and women as equals. Everybody noted it, but it took Julieann to actually name the elephant in the room and to bring about the change. So I think the bishops again and again have been challenged by Julieann's integrity. It was a huge disappointment that she wasn't chosen on behalf of the Irish people to be there at the Synod in Rome. But we look forward, she monitored it all the way along and ensured that we were all informed in as best as she could, with conscious of the secrecy from the actual process. And so over to you, Julieann, to share your comments and observations from your perspective. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Denise. I'm just laughing there at the introduction I've got. You're probably going to get a much more timid version of me this evening. And I don't know whether that's from a space of naivety or absolute clinging for hope. I think one of the things for me that I'd like to begin with is to say that, focusing on the first session, most definitely yes, and I will come to that. But what really excited me about the first session was the sense that this work began so much earlier, way back in March 2021, and the work that we actually did here in Ireland. So I suppose I was very intrepid about what we were getting to hear and what we were getting to see, because I felt I've been on a very particular journey in the role that I've had, and the stories that I've heard and the people that I've met, and the listening that we did at that diocesan stage, and how I felt that we embraced the spirit, small s, of the methodology with conversations in the spirit, and that round table methodology that we used as much as we could at diocesan level and at national level. The pre-synodal assembly in Athlone gave me such joy and such hope that we could sit in a room together with opposing points of view, and using that methodology show that we could be unified and still have our diverse opinions. So from Athlone, that excitement still stayed with me. I felt a huge sense of the responsibility that I had at that time as a member of the steering committee, and later as the General Secretary when I became appointed to that post, that we authentically and with integrity and honesty reported what it was that we heard. So I'm very proud of our national synthesis and the contribution that it made for the writers in Frascati. And I actually was quite happy with the document that came out for the continental stage, Enlarge the Space of Your Tent. I know there was a sense that as it filtered up and filtered back out in that circular dialogue, we were losing some things that are at the heart of what's so strong for some people. But I was really surprised to see so much that still resonated. You've talked about Prague and the Irish presentation there, again with integrity and with a huge sense of responsibility. I'm proud of myself that we reported authentically into that space, and that I called out the elephant in the room that day, the disappointment with that top table and there being no round table conversation. I don't want to linger too much on it, but I could still see us in the Instrumentum Laboris when it came out, all of those worksheets, and I was delighted to see that the Instrumentum was a document asking loads of questions, not a document repeating doctrine. So I was very, very hopeful. And then when the synthesis report came out, it's not that a disappointment isn't the right word, but it's so dense, and it was harder to see everything that I'd heard at diocesan level and at national level and at continental level. It was much harder to see it in the density of what's there in the synthesis report. But I'll come back to that, because I still believe in the model that we've been using of listening, synthesizing, reviewing, giving it back, listening again, and keeping that dialogue open. So I'm waiting with bated breath to see how each local church is expected to now deal with the document that we've been given. For me, from the first session, I can't believe how excited we're getting about round tables, by the way, but honestly, round tables and the visuals seem to have stolen the show, much more so than any of the content that was emerging from it. And it's kind of funny to sort of see headlines saying that the Vatican has discovered round tables, but for me, it speaks to a different style of leadership and a different style of decision making that we're seeing there, from the Pope to the 19-year-old from the United States, and all of the diversity that was in the room, being together in a very, very different way from previous synods. The vigil actually has stayed with me as a moment. I think sometimes we've moved straight into the session for me again, to see just how diverse Christianity is, never mind just how diverse we are in our Catholicism, but just that 20 or so leaders from the different Christian traditions together at the vigil was hopeful for me. To see so many women theologians, I was really hopeful there. Anna Rowlands in particular, her input has stayed with me. To see so many women participants, women speaking at the press conferences, I felt that was really important. So those visuals alone are very, very important. I was also really happy to see a sense of prayer and pilgrimage was prominent. So Timothy Radcliffe's, and we've heard already how significant his spiritual contributions were for the retreat and throughout the assembly, and Mother Angelini in a very different style. But that we got an opportunity to see, again, a discerning leadership working in a prayerful way through morning prayer, through the masses, through the pilgrimages that they took, the catacombs. and the embracing that they did of the conversations and the spirit, so much so that being described as a liturgical moment in and of itself. I suppose a third thing that has stayed with me from it is, I'll call it the honesty of the process and the document. We heard from Ormond Rush and actually Cardinal Hollerich that so many were struggling with the process and they were struggling with the notion of tradition. And I just distinctly remember Ormond Rush quoting then, who was then the Cardinal Ratzinger at the Second Vatican Councils, he was the Emeritus then, about that sense of the dynamic understanding of tradition, as seeing the past realised in the present, yet open to what was potentially there for the future to be revealed. I thought it was really interesting that that was addressed as publicly as it was. So I admire the honesty there that people, those that prepared the document on behalf of all of those that were discerning everything, were honest about that this wasn't easy for them, and that the document itself, in the way that even it's structured, shows that it wasn't an easy task. So many areas of convergence, but equally as many areas of divergence. I mean, they mightn't call it divergence, but the sense that matters for consideration in the document reveals that this wasn't plain sailing and it wasn't easy, and that everybody is struggling with this new way of trying to make decisions together. So it reveals the tension, and whilst that's a negative, I think it's positive that they were honest that that tension is still there. From my own role and how I feel that I have to coordinate the next phase of the Irish Synodal pathway, whilst also continuing to support the Universal, I was glad to see, actually, to a certain extent, that our next steps married with some of their next steps. We've done quite a lot of research here with those that held and led the listenings for our synodal pathway. So I was hopeful to see that the document that came out addressed the fact that the theology and spirituality of synodality is still quite weak, that there's confusion and concern there from a huge percentage of people, so that needs to be addressed. That people, again, in the document, it's addressing that we need to build discernment skills, accompanying skills, outreach skills, all of these things that are part of synodal leadership. And I'm happy to say will be part of the training programme that we've already prepared, that we'll roll out next year from an Irish perspective. So that's in terms of my role. But personally, I suppose what I'd like to say about things I'm happy with and things that I'm not happy with. And interestingly, Vatican II speaks to me for both of those. I was happy to see so much that this is about, realizing or bringing to fruition the fruits from the Second Vatican Council. But I was also quite saddened by the fact that here we are still trying to bring about something that happened so long ago. So there was a plus and a happiness and a sadness there for me that yes, the reception of the Second Vatican Council, but also sad that we're still talking about something that happened in 1965. Pluses for me, again, I think, and it comes from the heart of our national synthesis and our presentation in Prague and the final document out of Prague, that those who've been abused by members of the church is taking a place of prominence still, and that this was like this sin and this crime actually against God and humanity, that they're still saying needs to somehow be addressed comprehensively. I know they haven't given us a way forward as to how that's going to be done, but I'm glad to see that it's there and it's prominent. I was delighted to see the prominence of what was called the poor, but not just the poor materially, but the poor marginally, those that we've marginalised: migrants, refugees, Indigenous, addicts, minorities, women, and so many more. I was delighted to see the prominence of Catholic social teaching and the need to address clericalism, because it is absolutely the antithesis of synodality. I was delighted to see that the role of women is remaining prominent. Saddened that there isn't more clarity around the diaconate. But again, happy to see that they're being honest about the positions that people were taking in relation to it, so that more needs to be done. I'm delighted to see that there are proposals for changes in canon law, so that how we make and take decisions at local level, national level and universal level will change. An example of that maybe is 19G, with that sense that there's something there around a healthy decentralisation, that local churches would deal with local matters. A minus for me, I think, I don't see the whole process as having been secretive, perhaps discreet, and I think I've I've talked about this before, having had an experience of this minor circles in Prague, I probably wouldn't have spoken as honestly as I did in my own minor circles if I felt there was a camera on me 24/7 recording everything I had to say in those spaces. I thought we got a lot of content. Maybe a minus was that some of the plenaries should have been live streamed. Not that we got to see every last word of what everyone said. I do think people needed that freedom to speak audaciously, whether I agreed or disagreed. So maybe a little bit more there, but I was really happy with the amount of press conferences. I was happy that we got all of the papers, that we could that we were able to tune into the theological inputs and other inputs. What has stayed with me as a sadness is back at the diocesan stage, and as a writer of the National Synthesis, there was a line that has stayed with me, and it is the line that says, "Those who feel at home in the church feel the absence of those who don't." And I'm not seeing concrete steps in this document or the first stage to remedy this. We said back then on our day at the Pre-Synodal Assembly in Athlone that the church is at its very best when it's close to people's lives, speaking a language that people understand and connecting with people amidst their daily struggles. So in a hopeful way, while saddened by that we haven't seen something more concrete, I am hoping that session 2 makes this a reality.
Thank you very much, Julieann, and very valid comments. I think secrecy was probably the wrong word for me to use in light of what you were saying.
I know it's one that's out in the it's been well used in a lot. So yeah.
Yes. Thank you for your thorough analysis of the synthesis report and the pluses and minuses, which were very helpful and insightful, and again giving us good food for thought in terms of moving into the question and answer. And now, if we come to our last speaker, and definitely, have we kept the best to last, or all the speakers are speaking at such a high caliber? I think, Tom, you'll join that group with your wonderful expertise. Tom O'Loughlin is Professor Emeritus of the History of Theology at Nottingham University. He's a prolific writer, and also someone who consistently is offering an alternative and a prophetic voice, and in some ways very similar to some of the issues that Diarmuid raised in his sharing. So, Tom, you were recently in Limerick and challenged in terms of what you understand to be the future of the church at the local level. And as Julieann pointed out, where there was a genuine in acceptance of the process supported by the whole parish, and there was the honesty that came through and across the country and was still there in the European continental phase. And I think we have to keep bringing it back to plugging into that enthusiasm and honesty and the courage that people had to say the things that they really believe should change and that we should embrace as a gospel people. So over to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Denise. I would like to, following on from the three speakers, every word whose every word I would agree with and say, yes, that is the case. But I'd also like to look on this document in terms of its actual, what it tells us about the state of Catholic theology. When I read it initially, and I read it sort of with growing frustration and ire, was a sense of utter disappointment, the disappointment that we've heard expressed from Penelope. In the past 2 weeks, my attitude to the document has somewhat changed, and I've now decided it's a very neutral document, but a very useful one. And what I mean by that is this: it tells us almost for the first time exactly where we are in terms of official Catholic theology. We never got that at Vatican II. At Vatican II, we knew that there was every range of opinion, and everything was then subsumed into the final documents, which got virtually universal assent. So I'm looking at this document as a thermometer. The patient is in the bed, and we want to find out how sick or how well they are. And just as one would go to the patient with a glass thermometer, we can use this document for the state of Catholic theology. And what I mean by that is this. Early on in the document talks about the centrality of the Eucharist and says this is going to be at the heart of the Synodal Church. And you immediately say, absolutely right. That's where, if you're going to go for a synodal theology of the Church, you have to go for a Eucharistic ecclesiology, and you have to take all the problems and difficulties and challenges that makes to Western theology, at least since the 12th century, since Lateran IV. In the very next sentence, it says, but of course, we're so sorry that there are so many communities who just have liturgies of the word because there aren't any priests to serve them. And of course, immediately you have a synodal appreciation of the Eucharist, but you don't realize that with a synodal appreciation of the Eucharist, there cannot be a shortage of presbyters, because you find those within the communities and then you ordain them. The people who wrote this document have never been able to put together their theology of the Eucharist and their theology of what they would call priesthood. So the two theologies are operating in completely separate ways, in the way actually Pope John Paul II used to operate those two theologies every year in his letters to priests, where he'd say about, they're such sad that there are people, why don't you work harder, gentlemen? There are people out there who would love you to work harder. Without actually saying, what's going on in the community? Why is there a shortage? Is a shortage of vocations a possibility in the Catholic Church? If we accept our official theology of Eucharist, the answer is no. And yet when I was in Ireland at the weekend, I found out that the Irish bishops have started a giant nationwide campaign to pray for vocations. You don't pray for vocations, you find the people with the skills in the church and you empower them. That's why we have a theology of ex opere operato. I pointed out in Limerick, and I hope the bishop wasn't deeply offended, I said, to pray for vocations is to invoke a Calvinist theology of sacraments. But how come 60 years after Vatican II, which tried to put together a theology of Eucharist and a theology of the presbyterate, 60 years on, the two are completely apart. And so the patient on that measure is very ill indeed and very poorly informed. Let's look at another document, not the document from the Synod. Last week, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a document which was only published on the Vatican website in the last few hours, signed specifically by the Pope, on the question of whether you could baptize transgender people who were the products of same-sex unions through surrogate motherhood or whatever. And you just breathe a sigh of relief. They said, absolutely, yes. And in the comment it said, the church is not a customs union. The sad thing is, how poorly educated does a bishop have to be that he actually had to ask that question of the Vatican in the first place. Faced with anyone who is recognizable as a human being, we have to assume that God loves that person. And baptism is not some sort of silver spoon that's given to them just to show that they're nice. It's the recognition that the family of God bring that person into its own bosom. So when I look at the document from the Synod and its very impoverished theology of baptism, baptism is used on virtually in every paragraph. I actually did one of those searches on it. In virtually every paragraph, if you put in the word bapt, it comes up. And yet it's a very poor theology of baptism. Now, you might say, surely not. Let me tell you a story. About 35 years ago, I was attached to a parish where there was a bull of a parish priest, and it was Weberian. The theme that year for the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity was our common baptism. And I remember the Presbyterian minister was taking place, got utterly exasperated by what the parish priest was saying. The parish priest was used to utter acceptance. He had infused infallibility, this gentleman, and the Presbyterian said, that's not a Catholic theology of baptism. It's not a Lutheran theology of baptism. It's certainly not a Reformed theology of baptism. So how can we go forward with it? But it was a canonical theology of baptism. And I could see the parish priest was about to explode, and he said, "You don't tell me about baptisms. I've done as many of them as you've had hot dinners." The brute actually knew nothing. He hadn't thought about the status of the baptized. And the very fact that there's such a poor theology of baptism in the document actually shows that that parish priest or the bishop who asked those questions on whether people could be baptized or not shows just what a serious problem we have. And my third example is the whole question of the ordination of women to the diaconate. We've now had several historical investigations, and there are many books written on proving that you can't ordain women to the diaconate. But the document says, let's have more historical work done. Well, anyone who's a historian knows that historical work, number one, has been done for over 100 years. Number two, you don't do historical work in the same way you go off and you look up the log tables to find out what's the cosine of some angle. It's something that develops very slowly through very patient research. But it's clear that these people who are taking part in the Synod don't actually understand the relationship between critical historical investigation and theology. They're using the model based in the Reformation, looking for, have we a precedent? Now that's a process that belongs to the lawyers, not to the theologians. And the problem is this: by the time a theology of ordination had emerged, the practice of having women deacons had disappeared. You will therefore never find an ordained woman deacon in the early church. There may have been women deacons, there were, but that is a practice that disappeared before any notion of ordination had emerged. So you can see that they haven't even done basic homework. The problem, as I see it, is that it reveals just how impoverished Catholic theology is. This is not something new. We have known this since the Second Vatican Council. One of the periti at the Vatican Council said that attending the sessions in the Vatican for most bishops was a little bit like their first taste of a postgraduate course. The sad thing is we shouldn't have to be giving them basic information, much less postgraduate courses. I think it shows they haven't taken on board the deeper dynamics of the Second Vatican Council. They haven't kept up with theological method and the way theology works. And they have a very impoverished theology of baptism. Most are working out of an old model of theology, whereby you have a fixed method, very much akin to the way you solve a problem in maths, which then will come up with a conclusion whose certainty, very doubtful, doubtful, fairly certain, very certain, infallibly certain, can then be ticked off. So you say, this is the answer, and you give it a tick as to its quality. The patient is very ill. If this were a midterm report to a parent, you would use that dreadful phrase, can do better.
Is that a good moment to come in, Tom, or would you like to just finish the last
I want to finish
sentences?
on this. We have a very, if this is going to work in a year, we have a very big task.
Thank you, Tom.
very much, Tom. My apologies for coming in there. It's just we're leading into such a valuable question and answer time. Tom, thank you so much for bringing us right back at a very different slant from each of the three speakers. And in terms of sharing with us the impoverished, poor theology, really sad, very profoundly sad in terms of what you said. But thank you. So now I'll hand over to Ursula Halligan, who is going to pick up with the question and answers. Is that okay, Colin? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Denise. Well, thank you to all our four speakers for their excellent presentations and talks and sharing their thoughts. It was really wonderful. I enjoyed each one of your talks. So thank you again.